Hello, everyone. Welcome to another brief lecture for Philosophy 101, Introduction to Philosophy. This is a brief lecture on materialism and behaviorism in our section on metaphysics and philosophy of mind. So materialism and behaviorism, as was pointed out in the previous lecture, is the most recognizable form of opposition to substance dualism, which, as we saw from Rene Descartes, has been quite an influential view, not just in philosophy of mind, but also in discussions of religion and immortality, things like that. Materialism and behaviorism sees things differently. So we'll talk about what separates the views going forward. So we saw in the last lecture that Descartes thinks of substances as being of fundamentally two different types. Primary substance, which again is God and can only be God because of the attributes that Descartes thinks God has, right? Things like God is infinite, God is necessary, God is unchanging, right? Many things that religious doctrines often posit about God, specifically the monotheistic tradition. Whereas materialism and behaviorism takes our best physical theories to provide a more robust account of the workings of the human mind. Now, we should be careful here because this isn't to say that there aren't people of religious faith who aren't physicalists about the mind. But I do think that it's safe to say that most people, it would be strange to suggest that the mind and body are separate if you're a theist, and obviously not frame that within a conception of God, right? So in other words, it doesn't mean that you can't be religious and be a materialist, but it seems rather odd to posit materialism if, unless you have a different conception of mind and body than, the standard religious answers from Judaism, Christianity, Islam, things like that. So these don't correlate exactly with religious views, but certainly there's some overlap that's understandable. So we also mentioned functionalism, which is a view that goes against materialism and against substance dualism. So we'll briefly mention that going forward. And then we'll talk about free will in another lecture. Okay, so as always, please be sure to have a go at the reading before going through this lecture. I think the chapter does a pretty good job of laying out the typical tenets of materialism and behaviorism in philosophy of mind. And then hopefully you had a chance to already review substance dualism from Descartes. Okay, so we mentioned Leibniz and Malebranche, Nicholas Malebranche, as well as Descartes. They're all substance dualists, but they're also thinkers from roughly 400 years ago. And dualism, as you might have seen in a psychology class, has a lot of outstanding issues that need to be addressed, primarily the interaction problem, which we saw previously. So recall that the interaction problem is a problem posed to Descartes and really all substance dualists, that how is it possible that a non-physical entity like the mind or the soul interacts with a physical substance? What is that interaction? How can it be explained? This is the ghost in the machine type objection. So because of this and because of Descartes, we want to be charitable. Descartes didn't have the advantage of modern psychology and brain science during the 17th century, so we want to be charitable. But how can we make sense of that? How can we move forward with psychology, neuroscience, with that understanding? A lot of scientists are going to say, as we've seen, that Descartes, while this is a big step forward, it's really not giving us the kind of modern conception of mind that is borne out by modern science. So this is why materialism and behaviorism really start to take off after Descartes. So we're looking at the 18th, 19th, and especially 20th centuries. Materialists argue that since only physical bodies and systems exist, then the activities we attribute to the mind, or even what Descartes would call the soul, are really activities of our material body. And we should be able to explain the operations of the mind in terms of the workings of the body. So in other words, if you're a materialist, you think that these mental states that we have, or even brain states, the idea that I have now that I'm hungry, or the feeling of boredom even, or the experience I have with a cup of coffee every morning, those are all attributable to physical brain states. In other words, we can explain it by simply explaining the workings of the human brain. Now, materialism is going to get a lot of support, we think, in the 20th century in particular, as psychology really starts taking off as an empirical discipline, and we start understanding a little bit more and more about how the brain works. So a lot of people think that this whole discussion is open and shut. It's not open and shut. There are still disagreements about the nature of the mind. And as I said before, there are still dualists out there. But a lot of people think that materialism gets a lot of increased support from empirical sciences, that we are able to explain all things, all mental phenomena, by appealing to physiology, right? Now, not everyone agrees with that, right? Dualists still have a response, and so do other views like functionalism and property dualism. So the discussion is not closed, but materialists think that for the most part, the sciences that we get in the latter part of the 18th, 19th, and then 20th centuries really supports the materialist and the physicalist views of mind. So this leads to this discussion of what we call reductionism. So this is Thomas Hobbes, a very famous British philosopher. He was a materialist before materialism really took off. So to give him credit, like Descartes, he's really advocating a view that didn't really necessarily have a lot of academic cachet. And Hobbes was a materialist, and he embraced a form of what we call reductionism. And this is the viewpoint that the structure and or function of one kind of thing, say the mind, can be exhaustively explained by, sorry for the typo, the structure and function of another kind of thing, the body. So in other words, the mind can just be reduced to the functions of the body. This is what it means to reduce. And if so, then there is no need to postulate the existence of immaterial substances like minds and souls. Instead, we just acknowledge that only material things exist and try to explain it by physical things, physical processes, and physical properties. Now, of course, people are going to object to this move by reductionists like Hobbes. One might say Hobbes's version of materialism fails to convince many that mental activities are purely physical. So as I mentioned before with a few examples, the materialist and the physicalist, which again, we're using interchangeably, thinks that my experience of drinking a cup of coffee is really just reducible to physical processes, okay? But a lot of people think, understandably, that there are some experiences that just transcend merely physical processes. Maybe your example might be love or interactions with beautiful things like art and music, that maybe there are experiences that we as humans have that cannot be reduced to merely physical processes. So a lot of people are unpersuaded that all human experiences can be reduced to purely physical processes. And many wondered whether reductionism was even possible, right? So they want to, critics want to flip the script on reductionists, just like people wanted to flip the script on Descartes. So remember, in Descartes, his problem was, how do you explain a non-physical thing interacting with a physical thing? But people similarly had problems for the materialists. How can a very complicated physical system, supposing that the mind is just a physical system, produce mental phenomenon that seem to have no physical characteristics, right? In other words, when we have a feeling of love or euphoria or some experience, the criticism goes, that doesn't seem to just be purely physical. There seems to be something non-physical about those experiences. And if that's the case, then materialism can't be true. It can't be the whole story. So a variety of responses to these criticisms have been given. We'll leave aside those responses, but certainly there are different types of materialism and physicalism that are outlined in the reading. So one view is called identity theory. And I mentioned this before. This is the view that holds that conscious states are just identical with the body's brain states. So we might have a conscious state, which we think is separate, but really just is a brain state, right? So there's a physical process that the brain goes through. So when we're aware of, say, being happy or being excited about something, there's a corresponding but physical brain state, right? So that's identity theory, that conscious states are just brain states, right? They're identical. And then we have behaviorism, which is a view much popularized by psychologists like Skinner and others. And this is a view in both psychology and philosophy that says that conscious mental states are bodily behaviors or dispositions. And these can be traced back to either evolution via natural selection, right? We can just study this with human evolution and how humans respond to their environment. But that's a purely physical process, right? There's no need to postulate non-physical entities here. So there's two different kinds of materialism, physicalism. There's also functionalism, which contends that mental states are functions between inputs and outputs. So this is the view that essentially we're like computers. Now, there's disagreement on whether functionalism is really a materialist view. A lot of people, myself included, think that it is, because all the inputs and even the outputs are, can be described by physical theories and explanations, but there's some disagreement on that. So this influential theory has led, as I said, philosophers to the view that the human brain is a kind of computer, right, with hardware and software. So I'd be curious to know, either via the discussion or even if you want to just send me a message, does this view appeal to you? Does this view seem to capture the essence of both perhaps dualism and what we like about materialism? Some people really like functionalism. We also have another variety, which is called eliminative materialism. And this is just the view that mental conscious states, desires, beliefs, intentions, those don't exist. So what this means, this is opposed to identity theory, because identity theory holds that we have these conscious states, but those just are brain states. So there might be two separate things, but one really just is this. Eliminative materialism is just, it thinks that everything is a brain state. There is no non-brain state. All conscious states, whether I desire more food or whether I believe that it's warm outside or I intend to do something, all that's just brain activity, right? So that would be full-scale extreme materialism, right? That everything is just neurons firing, period, right? There's no non-mental brain state, right? There's certainly no mind outside of the body. So this is the most extreme anti-dualist view that perhaps you could take. So if that gives you some context. So to talk about identity theory for just a second, we get a contribution from famous philosopher J.J.C. Smart. He argues for identity theory. So he takes materialism and applies it to personal identity. What makes someone one and the same through time? So certainly a conversation we're having about artificial intelligence. So in this view, mental states are just physical brain states. He likes the identity theory because it establishes a clear causal relationship. In other words, right, we can have physical brain states cause mental states, and perhaps even mental states causing physical brain states. And what's nice about this view, as I mentioned before, is that it potentially avoids the problems with Cartesian dualism and also some other problems that one might raise about views that we about this that we haven't talked about. But a lot of people just like this view because it's simple. It just says, well, brain states just are mental states, right? So they're identical, and this can help us in our theories of personal identity and maybe even AI. So there's a couple very famous objections to materialism about philosophy of mind. One is Chalmers's zombie argument, which it's not exactly like the zombies that we see in TV and movies or The Walking Dead. There's also objections to this from the non-materialists, right? So we'll talk about that in just a second. So again, the identity theory tells us that mental states are identical to physical brain states, but these thought experiments, the zombie example, and which I posted a video for, and then Nagel's bat example, are supposed to show that mind-brain identity is implausible, that they really can't be the same thing. Okay, so I would recommend, I'm not going to play the video now, but I'd recommend that you watch this. I posted a link and see if you find the zombie argument convincing against materialism. Okay, so hopefully you've watched the video. The argument goes roughly like this. Premise one, it is conceivable that there be zombies. Premise two, if it is conceivable that there are zombies or there be zombies, it is metaphysically possible that there could be zombies. Premise three, if it is metaphysically possible that there be zombies, then consciousness is non-physical. Therefore, consciousness is non-physical. So the idea behind the zombie argument, again, if we're looking at the thought experiment, is that if we can conceive metaphysically that it's possible that there are these zombies that are like us, but not really us, Chalmers thinks that this shows that consciousness is non-physical. So thus, materialism and physicalism is false. Now, a lot of people disagree about what the thought experiment really shows. He thinks that it shows that materialism can't be plausible because of that. Others think, well, no, that doesn't really show that it's implausible. It just shows, if anything, that things can be purely physical, right? That there could be a zombie Anthony such that it's not really Anthony per se, it's just Anthony's body, but devoid of certain kinds of brain function. That doesn't show that physicalism or materialism is false. But again, this is why we get into these conversations. So watch the video on the zombie argument, see if you find this convincing. Some people think that it does show a problem for materialism. And if you're interested in seeing more about this, there's an additional chapter on property dualism that I can point you to. Okay, perhaps the more famous counter argument to materialism, or views like it, comes from Thomas Nagel, who has this very famous bat argument. The article is appropriately titled, "What is it like to be a bat?" So the argument goes something like this. If materialism is correct, then we could explain what it is like to be another conscious being, because physical states, which scientific study can provide, would be identical to mental states. We cannot explain what it is like to be another conscious being. Therefore, materialism is not correct. So it's a really simple argument when you break it down. We could even think of, I'm going to use cats because I have 2 cats and maybe you have pets too. It's a question. Do you think even after we study everything there is to know about cats, if we take one of my cats, Sophie, and we study her brain, we study every single thing we know about her, right? We run hopefully non-intrusive tests. We run all kinds of experiments, again, hopefully ethical experiments. Does that really tell us what it's like to be a cat? Most of you are going to say no, right? We might know everything about how a cat brain works, how cats, what their color spectrum is, how fast they can run, right? What they're eating, their anatomy is like, but we'll never fully understand what it's like to be a cat. That's Nagel's argument, except he uses bats. And so what he's saying here is that if we can't understand what it's like to be a cat or a bat, then that means that materialism doesn't give us the whole story, because if materialism is correct, then we would know what it is like to be a bat, or we would know what it is like to be a cat, right? But we can't do that, no matter how much we study cats or bats, right? We can't know what it's like for my cat Sophie to experience the world, really. Now, maybe you think, well, just give it a few years, which a lot of people might say, but people like Nagel and others are going to say, well, we might get close, but we'll never really know what it's like to be Sophie the cat, what it's like to experience a day in the life of Sophie the cat, no matter how hard we try. And because of that, materialism and physicalism can't give us a full story. Okay, so just to summarize what Nagel's famous argument is, why can't we know what it's like to be a bat? Well, we cannot understand what it's like to be a bat in terms of the ideas of the mental concepts we apply to human beings, right? The same thing goes for my cat, Sophie. I can only understand what it's like to be a cat by bringing my own concepts of what it's like as a human, but that's not going to work, because there's no way that I can embody a cat without bringing my human qualities with me, right? So that's not going to work. Our ability to imagine anything is limited to the materials provided by our own experience. But we should not, on the basis of our inability to conceive of it, deny that there is something it is like to be a bat. So even if I can't experience what it's like to be a cat or a bat, Nagel says there is something that it is like to be, right? Sophie has a kind of experience, right? But I just will never be able to capture it. And so Nagel thinks that this kind of thought experiment is a problem for the materialist. Because if the facts about what experience is like for an organism are available only from that organism's point of view, then it seems that these facts of experience cannot be captured in purely physical terms. No matter how much I study the brain, no matter how much I study, right, bats or cats or whatever animal that's non-human, I'll never know what it's really like to have an experience like they do. And because of that, materialism must be defective or incomplete. Okay, so this with the zombie argument are meant to be two challenges to the materialist and physicalist account of the mind. But whether or not these thought experiments are successful in your mind, I'll be curious to get your opinion. So let me leave it there. Keep this short. Hopefully this gives you some idea about what materialism and physicalism are about and some of the various views. If you have any questions, please let me know. And thanks as always for listening.